Welcome everybody to what will be our last indoor meeting for the 2023 spring season. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce to you Courteney Smith, one of my colleagues in Nature Reserves. Courteney is a warden on 4 nature reserves, Fens Pools, Barrow Hill, Cotwell End Valley and Buckpool and the Lees. And tonight she's going to tell us about a bit of a project we've been thinking about for some time now, and is becoming more of a reality through the work of Courteney and the colleagues, called the Newt Route. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Courteney.
Thank you so much.
Tell us about the Newt Route.
Yeah, so thank you for coming and thank you for having me. It's certainly a bit more experience for me, and it just gets me a chance to speak about what I'm passionate about, which is wildlife, which is always nice. So yeah, as Graham was saying, my name's Courteney, and very fortunate to work on the nature reserves in Dudley that I do. I've been with Dudley Council now for about 5 years this summer. My background is that I have an honours degree in wildlife conservation, so I was very fortunate to be able to come out of university and get the job that I wanted, basically. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is basically our project in some of our nature reserves, and that's called the Newt Route. And that's all about that little guy that you can see there, which is the great crested newt, and how we're trying to help habitats throughout our nature reserves, just so we can protect our endangered species. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is just what nature reserves we have in Dudley, what we do as countryside services, as wardens, also touch on a little bit of our geology that we have on the reserves. I'll say now, I'm not a geologist, so I'm ever so sorry if I get anything wrong, any pronunciations or anything like that. And then also talk about the great crested newt and what we're doing on our conservation of them. So here's Dudley, all the green space you can see. We do have quite a lot of green space. We're quite fortunate being such an urban environment that we do have as much green space as we do. So we have some national nature reserves. The guy in the corner will be very happy to hear about that. His reserve is on here. So firstly we have Wren's Nest. So that's that little star up in the corner that's come up here. And our second one that we have is Salt Wells. I believe they were only made a national reserve, was it last year or the year before? Wren's Nest is our oldest. Nicely as well, I think we are the only local government borough to have 2 national nature reserves due to our geology, you've possibly heard. And then we have our other nature reserves, so they're designated as local nature reserves. So we have Fens Pools, Buckpool and Barrow Hill. So those are these guys here. And those are the ones that I am based at. We also have the Leesos, which is Halzowen down here. And we also have Cotwell End, which is one where I'm based at as well. Go back a little bit. We do have other little ones. So we have Alder Coppice that's up here. That one was only made a local nature reserve in the past couple of years as well. And we also have some more in the Halzowen area. But these are our main ones that we have Countryside Services of Dudley based at. So this is Countryside Services. This is what we basically do. So we're the wardens on the ground that take care of all our nature reserves. So we do that through habitat management and creation. So we do all sort of like grassland work, wetland, woodland, you name it, we do it. Reserve maintenance, that's looking after the reserves in terms of public use as well. So we'll maintain the reserve in terms of path edges, making sure the reserve is safe, clean, all that kind of stuff. Wildlife conservation, that's a big thing. We're always on the lookout for what wildlife we have, so we do that through surveying. But then also once we know what species we have, we need to know how we can conserve them. And we also do public engagement as well, so that's through doing talks like this. We also have stuff like kids activities, events that we run, walks, etc. for people to come and see the nature reserve, come and appreciate it and know exactly what we do. So this is our habitat management work. We get up to quite a lot, as you can see. So they're techniques for the benefits of wildlife and also to improve diversity. The more that we look after habitat, the hopefully more diversity of species we'll get and the more enriched an ecosystem will be. So some examples up here, so we have some grass cutting taking place. So that can be to make sure that we have more species of grass come up in our grasslands, so they're a bit more rich. We can also have our wildflower diversity come up in our grasslands if we do cut them. The more wildflowers we have, the more insects, more mammals, amphibians, stuff like that, as you can see. Other stuff we do could be our hedges. This is a process called hedge laying. If anybody does want to visit Barrow Hill after you've heard this talk, this is the kind of thing you'll see. Also at Wren's Nest there is hedge laying as well. So this is the process of taking a hedge which could be a bit stunted, a bit old, but through this process of cutting it and then laying it but keeping the tree alive, it then spurs on some new growth. Rejuvenates the hedge basically, and it helps diversity of wildlife. Pond and wetland creation as well. So this is the either putting in new ponds or taking care of existing ponds just to make sure they don't go too overgrown and not any use for any wildlife at all. We do hedge restoration as well, so if a woodland becomes too thick, we can also sort of go in there, thin it out. Thinning of the woodland can help understories and then again promotes diversity of species. So just going to talk a little bit now about the couple of reserves that I'm on, that I basically know a bit more about. So Fens Nature Reserve, that one's based in Pensnet in the Dudley Borough. It's actually known as the largest area of open water in the borough. As you can see from this map here, we have these three larger pools and this little tiny one here. We're known as a triple SI, so Site of Special Scientific Interest, and that is actually for our population of amphibians, is why we're called a triple SI. We're also called a SAC, so that's a Special Area of Conservation. I believe that's a European designation, but again that's for our amphibian species. Historically it was part of the Earl of Dudley's railway, so this was the Pensnet Railway and this was in the 1800s. So that was a railway that would have ran, I believe it was across this line, and then it ran all the way sort of through Kings Wynford Way. And it was declared a Nature Reserve in 1993, so that's actually older than me, just to put that out there. Only by 3 years though, sadly. So geology of Fens pools. Again, I'll just admit that I'm not a geologist, so we'll see how this goes. So the geology of Fens pools, it's on the, well, let's see if I get this right. Etruria Mole, is that right? Something like that. So that's a calcium-rich mudstone and it holds water. So that's an excellent conditions for our pools, as you can imagine. So it's the part of the Westphalian stage of the Upper Carboniferous period. So that's between 313 to 304 million years ago. It's multicoloured, so it's got colours ranging from grey, green and brown. Because of the geology that was once part of the Pensnet Chase, it then turned to industrial. So Fens pools during the industrial times that Dudley was very much a part of, Fens pools was used for coal mining, clay extraction and brickwork. It was definitely more so used as clay for bricks, especially the blue engineering bricks that we have there. Collieries and clay pits were closed in the early 20th century, whereas the railway only just closed in the 1960s. The colliery race ground is now grassland, so you can see that around about there. It's sort of like a grassland area now. And then these were the clay pits which have now flooded to then create our pools and reservoirs. Part of Fens pools is owned by Dudley Council, but then also part of it is Canal and Rivers Trust. So we have a canal system and the pools are used as feeding reserves for the canal system as well. So it's partly owned by us and then partly owned by Canal and Rivers Trust. So we sort of do partnership work. We'll look after some certain piece of land and they'll look after their reservoirs. So this is Barrow Hill Nature Reserve, probably one that you guys will probably know more so than Fens pools. But it is connected to Fens pools along a linear corridor. It's quite close by, so still classed as Pensnet nature in the Pensnet area. It's actually an extinct Dudley volcano, so it's the only proven example of surface volcanic activity in the Black Country. It's part of the Black Country Geopark and it's a site of national importance. It was once part of the Pensnet Chase along with Fens pools, so that would have been this area that the Baron of Dudley used as his hunting ground, and the church that's on Barrow Hill is known to be the church that he would have gone to for his services that he went. It was quarried in the 17th and the 18th century, which now reveals the geology of the volcano, as I'm sure you're aware. It was declared a local nature reserve in 2005, so apart from Alder Coppice, which was the one at the top of the map that I showed you earlier, it's actually one of our youngest nature reserves, and it's also a site of importance for nature conservation. I do believe it is a triple SI as well, just like Fens pools, but instead of a triple SI for its amphibians, it's more for its geology factors. Are you going to? Yes. So the Dudley Volcano, so 350 million years ago, so that was in the Carboniferous period. I do hope that's right. Dudley was in a vast tropical river delta swamp. So back then Dudley would have been situated somewhere completely different, so I believe we were near the equator, and that was due to continental drift. The Dudley Volcano was formed approximately 307 million years ago, and that was a result of being on a technical tectonic fault line. Due to its geology and preservation, it allows a deeper understanding into the Carboniferous period. I believe this is due to all the fossils that would have been found in all this rock formation. So the geology of it, managed to find some nice diagrams there. Tried to make sense of them myself. Give me a good laugh anyway this afternoon. Geology of Barrow Hill is it Dolorite? Something like that? That's the one. Which is an intrusive igneous rock. It was once molten magma, which then intruded into existing rock in the sills and the dikes, creating insulated crystals. Large quarries were excavated into the hill. So this is that's the hill part there, and that's where this cross will be. And that was to extract the basalt, or that rock, to be used as material to construct roads. Now the exposed geology means Barrow Hill has unique geological features. So that's the columnar joining and also the weathering of the rock that you can see quite clearly when you walk into the quarry area. That is one of our geological spots of interest. So now we've got that part out of the way, the main sort of thing that I know about and the main product of this talk is this guy. So this is our great crested newt. So now we know about our nature reserves, now we know a little bit about where they are. I'll just now talk about him and why he's so important. So great crested newt, they're protected in the UK under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, and this is because they are a priority species, and that's under the UK biodiversity framework. It's listed as a European protected species, and that's because its populations in the UK are internationally important. I believe we have one of the best populations for a great crested newt throughout Europe, but sadly they are still on the decline, so that's why they're of so importance and why they're protected by law. They're amphibians, So that means that they breed in ponds during the spring, and then they also come out of the ponds and they spend most of their time outside in the grassland, tussocky grass area, woodlands as well, marshes, hedgerows they'll go into. And then when they're out of the ponds, they'll feed on stuff like insects, all other kinds of invertebrates. And then they'll hibernate underground throughout the winter. So they spend part of their lifetime in the pools, but then they'll also come out and be more on a terrestrial sort of habitats instead of in the water. And they're our biggest species of newts, so they're about 17 centimetres. So believe that's about the size of your palm, sort of like from the bottom right to the tip of your finger. They are a very big newt, sort of like if you get a full-grown male, you can't really get confused of it being something else. It's one of our biggest. Well, it is our biggest. So metapopulations. So this is one of the things that we have to consider when working with populations of species. One of our problems with the great crested newts, they have a few things that threaten them, if you will, and one of these is that they can't spread their genetics as much. So what happens in urban environments specifically, is that populations get cut off from each other. It's not like us where we can just think, I'll just walk across the street, no problem. Animals have to be careful of what they do. They can become very sort of endangered to crossing roads, as you can imagine. Something about the size of your hand isn't going to want to travel miles and miles away, especially if they come up to urban fringes, stuff like that, stuff that endangers them. So metapopulations, that's basically a regional group of connected populations of a species. So it's a population of a population, basically. So here we go, just to demonstrate. So this here is Barrow Hill, and this here is Fens Pool. But as you can see, we have some populations here. They're all sort of spread out, but they're all localised. So these populations, they can't necessarily access each other, especially these guys, because they're separated by urban walls, essentially. So really what happens is their genetics get too constrained. They sort of breed and breed and breed with each other until there's not much genetic difference. There's no diversity in there. So you'll probably find that weaker individuals get weaker and weaker throughout the genetics. So you need to be able to have a mix of populations in order to make genetics a bit stronger. So as much as we want diversity within ecosystems, we also want diversity within genetics. So how do we fix that? How do we, as wardens or as people of the public or anybody who wants to help nature, what do? We can add corridors in. So green corridors, these are a way that we can add habitats into the urban environment, and that helps guide animals across the landscape. So for an example, here we could have either patches of woodland, we can have ponds, you can have grassland areas. If you introduce these places, they're classed as stepping stones, and stepping stones can then be travelled across, they can be used, and that is called a green corridor. So then, once you implement it, once there is a corridor there that they can pass through the environment, see if this works, they will then mix. So this is the mixing of the general localised populations. So they all mix together, they all move around. And there we go. So that shows that we've got a mix of genetics now. So if these reds were possibly a little bit weaker, maybe for their genetics, they've probably been breeding for generations until there's not much genetic diversity. If they can then breed with, say, these yellow ones, that means they then have some more genetics to play around with. Same here for Fens Pool. We can turn one population, mix it with another, and then we have a more healthy, collaborated genetic gene pool. But what can be even better than mixing all of these gene pools would be to add another green corridor. So that would be cutting through all this urban environment here. If you imagine that all of this white around all these nature reserves is urban, we can add in other green corridors and we can mix the genetics even more between the nature reserves. Just like that. So then it becomes even more genetically diverse. And there we go. Whole new gene pools just opened up because we've mixed the two nature reserves genetics together. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what we hope to do with our Newt Route. What we're trying to do is connect all of the newts in this area to this area, so we can ultimately have higher populations but also genetically diverse ones as well. You have stronger individuals, new mix of genetic sort of individuals, and altogether they will be more healthy that way. If you want to do something naturally, which also benefits other wildlife as well as not just the newt, you can put these corridors in. Because yeah, thankfully it's not something that we're just aiming for. The newt, this green corridor that we're implementing, is going to be vastly improving for other wildlife as well. If we can give them this sort of like a bit of a commute, if you will, it's easy for them to go through the urban landscape and therefore not be as in such a threat with our urban challenges, if you can imagine. So this is our very ambitious sort of project. So here we have Fens pools again, and we have, I think it's around about there, we have our population of great crested newts. This is Barrow Hill, and I think there is our population, or it might be a little bit over here, I think. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to create a corridor all the way through this urban environment, which you can tell looks really urban, very built up, is we're going to take them all the way through and eventually end up in a completely different borough. I believe it's Staffordshire Borough. That's the one, yeah. Over to Baggeridge. So at the moment, Dudley Council, we're working on this section of the corridor here. So we're trying to link up our two nature reserves, and then what we will do along the way is try and go all the way through here. And I believe that connects up to the old railway. It's called the Old Railway Walk, and that is where the Pensnet Railway was, the Baron of Dudley's railway, which started all the way in Fens pools, and it did run along this current. So we're just taking an old industrial linear connection through the environment, but we're just turning it a little bit greener. It essentially already has pockets of greenery. We're just trying to join them up in certain ways. So this is a very ambitious project. So the wildlife corridor, it's a green corridor that links Fens pools to Barrow Hill and then to Baggeridge. The hope is to link up the pockets of great crested newts, and that will create new populations and new genetics. It's a network of habitats for wildlife to travel. So what we will do is we'll create ponds. So great crested newts, they'll go from one pond to another. They'll breed in a pond, they'll come out of it. Maybe then they'll go and breed in that pond the same the next year. But those youngsters in that pond, they may decide to travel a bit further to reach new territories. So generations will use this corridor. You may not have, well, you won't have one newt, say, start at Fens Pool and end up in Baggeridge, but you will have generations of that newt move across this green corridor. Other ways that we'll do this is through high binocular. So we've got just this old plastic tubing that we found just lying around on the nature reserve. It's been fly tipped, obviously, but we turned it into something more that's usable. Filled it with sort of like bracken, logs that maybe we had a tree come down in the woodland. That tree's got to go somewhere, so cut it up, place it in here, and it makes a nice little high binocular for newts or any other amphibians to go in. So they'll spend the winter hibernating there. Here's another one. So this one was made out of old pallets. Put some bracken in, put some, I believe there's some bricks in there as well, some house bricks, branches and so on and so forth. And then here we have our hurt mats as well. So they're just basically corrugated sheeting. But if you place them out in a grassland, they can be very good refuges for our cold-blooded groups, sort of like your reptiles and your amphibians. They like to bask in places like that. You can sometimes find them underneath. It's really good for them to get insulated heat. So these are basically your stepping stones. So if you place all of these sort of habitats along the route, that's what creates our green corridor. Along the way, we'll also make sure to take good care of our grasslands, our woodlands as well, and we just make sure that they have places to go to every step of the way. So this is our corridor progress. So here we have our map showing partially what the outer area is going to look like, and then this orange line is the corridor, as this red square here is basically this map. So you can see that what we've done is all these circles of ponds that we've put in. Different colours represent different years. So in, is that 2021 we started the project? So in 2021 we put these ponds in. I believe, Ian, you helped out with some of those, didn't you? Yep. This blue one here, this one was put in 2022, and then just this year we've added these yellow ones. So that's in 2023. And then also we've got these squares, which are the hibernacular that we've put in, and these green ones are the hurt mats. But from just this generalised diagram, you can tell that what we're trying to do is create this formation. So what we have here is this is where our great crested newts are at the moment, in this pool that's been there for years. It's very established, it has a very well established population. But what we want to do is we want to get these great crested newts all the way over here, so it can start going along the corridor. It can go to Fens Pool, which is about here, cut off from the map, or it can go up towards Baggeridge. But first, before we even think of getting them along this line, we've got to get them through the nature reserve and to it. So this is where we're trying to link this up. The reason why we're not going hell to leather, so to speak, why we're not rushing ahead and thinking we've got to get as many ponds as we can, rush ahead and get them all dug out, etc., why we're taking a slow time in, say, putting a handful in each year, this is because of succession. So with ponds, if you want them to be healthy, what you want is you want a diverse range. So throughout our corridor, what we want is these ponds will now be a couple of years old. So they will be at a different stage of succession. So these older ponds now, they will have all the vegetation coming through. At the moment, we'll be having the frog spawn coming in. So what happens is a pond, it's brand new, young if you like. The vegetation comes, then all the animals start to move in. So the insects will move in first, or your pond-loving invertebrates. Then you'll have the frogs move in and the toads move in, probably the next year later once the pond is more established. Then once the pond is then even more established into the ecosystem, the newts start to come in. That will probably be smooth newts first, and then the great crested newts will then move in more so later on, possibly around 4 or 5 years down the line. So it's a long process to actually get the great crested newts to use the ponds, but they prefer a more succession pond. They prefer the vegetation to really have taken hold. The reason for this is their breeding cycle. So what a great crested newt does is it goes into the pond, but it likes to have the vegetation around it, and that's because it has an area in the middle that it likes to be clear, if you will, and the male will display with its crest, hence the name great crested newt. It also has a silver flash on its tail, So it dances in the water so it can attract a mate. Sort of like one of those birds of paradise you see on David Attenborough all the time. So it dances in the water to attract a female. Female decides you look like the best, strongest male for me. They'll then breed, and then what the female does is she lays one egg at a time. She'll find blades of the vegetation and she'll actually fold the egg into vegetation to keep it nice and safe. So that's why the newts won't move in until a certain time. They prefer a pond to be more established. They need the vegetation. They need the outer ring to be vegetated, but then also the water to be nice and clear so they can display in it. So that's why we have different stages of ponds. We'll have, so these younger ones, these will be for sort of like your frogs, your toads, get them established. And then we'll have these ones which hopefully the great crested newts will move into first. So that's essentially what we're doing along this progress. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple years. This is going to be a really big sort of project, I think, throughout the rest of my career, more so. But we'll eventually get there, and hopefully it will be very beneficial to our conservation and wildlife. But there are some challenges that we face along the way, and sadly this is for the case of our great crested newt. They also have challenges. Every wildlife has its challenges, especially being in an urban environment. So we have land barriers. So this is just a screenshot of our local area. This is Fens Pool, so I believe our population of newts is around about here. And then this is Barrow Hill, where that map was that I just showed you. And what we need to do is we need to get the newts from here all the way along this line, which is the old railway line again. We need to get them through here, which is okay because it's still green. There's plenty of places there that we can place ponds, high binocular, the stepping stones to get them there. But the challenge we then face is there's a road here. So it's getting them from this reserve to that one without them having to cross the road. This could be a very ambitious project where we then end up putting a tunnel underneath the road. That's way down the line. What we'll do is we'll establish corridors in Fens Pool first, we'll establish Barrow Hill first, and then we'll try and join the two. Multiple corridors happening all at the same time to then verge into one big corridor is the hope. So we have our land barriers, which is the problem. Sadly, due to it being urban reserve, as you can imagine, some challenge that we have is antisocial behaviour. So that can be due to motorbikes, you can see here going through the grassland, destruction of high binocular, you can put it there one day, come back the next, it could be destroyed, who knows. Stealing of the hurt mats, we've had that before, where you've placed them down and you think you've hidden them well. Somebody comes and finds them and they've got a new shed roof, who knows. Fire is another one, especially in our hotter summers that we're having now. And we also have litter. But that's where we come in as our wardens. We do our best for the nature reserve. So what we do is, no matter what challenges we come across, we'll go ahead and fix it. Whatever it takes to keep our wildlife safe, we'll do it. Chytrid fungus. So that's an infectious fungal disease for our amphibians. So this is sadly a disease that once they catch it is a fatality for them. So this is one of our threats to our newts and also to frogs, toads, stuff like that, is that they're coming into contact with this disease, coming into contact then with each other, basically like how COVID was for us. They just then spread it through the population. So we have to be careful that whilst we're linking up populations, we also don't want to be spreading this fungus and this disease. So what we go ahead with, mainly with partnership with our Birmingham and Black Country amphibian and reptile group, the BBC ARG group, is they go ahead and they test the water, but they also test any amphibians they come across, seeing if they carry this chytrid fungus, because we don't want them to be spreading along. Thankfully, in Barrow Hill, it's quite free of chytrid fungus. It has been tested, or the water's been DNA tested as well for great crested newts. We know that it's healthy, we know that it's safe, so we can go ahead and put these stepping stones in. But we still have to be very careful. I know especially in Fens pools, there's the potential issue of this chytrid fungus, and that's due to alpine newts, which is another challenge. On that note, another challenge we face is the alpine newt, which is an invasive species. So these would be non-native newts that have come into the country possibly by the pet trade. They're more sort of flashy than our native newts. They've been kept as pet trade, possibly then released or escaped. And these species are pushing out our native ones, sort of like a red squirrel, grey squirrel scenario. So the alpine newt is more generalised, whereas our great crested newt is more specialised. The alpine newt will come ahead and it will eat the food before the great crested newt becomes available to it. Basically, they'll come out the ponds a bit quicker and then eat all the frog spawn that the great crested newts would have liked. So this is what forces our great crested newts to sadly be endangered, because the alpine newts are getting better at surviving. Our great crested newts are sadly not. And this is also the case for smooth newts as well, being outcompeted by the alpines. Another invasive species, but comes in a plant form, is called Crested. It's also the New Zealand pygmy weed, and it's a non-native invasive pond plant. So we believe that this plant has come over during stuff like fisheries. A fish could have a little tiny particle of a Crested plant, and it could be transported, transplanted. You have it in a fish tank, it gets too big, put it in a pond in a nature reserve. It's then spread this plant. It's a submergent plant, so it lives under the water, but then it's also an emergent plant, so it comes out of the water as well. It can basically grow anywhere in a pond, and the problem with this plant is that it suffocates the pond. Nothing else can grow. It grows and grows and grows to the point where there's no pond at all. It's just wetland vegetation, and no pond to speak of. So we do have to be careful that if we have this vegetation in one of our ponds, we again don't want to be putting more ponds in that a newt could spread this plant within it. Because like I say, it only takes one tiny particle of this plant and it will regenerate. So what we do as part of our Green Corridor project is that if we see this plant, it gets pesticide sprayed in the safest way possible, just to get rid of it, because it's quite invasive and challenging for our newts and any other amphibian species and the habitats as a whole. Another challenge that we face, and not just for the Green Corridor but possibly for everything, is our budget. As with any local government, as with any department that you're in, budget can be quite limited. So we just have to do the best we can with the budget that we have. Possibly takes a lot of money sometimes to put a pond in. So we'll do a couple a year. We can see where the budget takes us. Get help from other sources, for example, as well, just to see how much money we can spend on projects such as this. But we do try our best. But the big question is it being a success? It's still only new, this Newt Route project. But the simple answer is yes, it's succeeding already, which we are very, very happy with. Like I said before, the newts like a pond which is good with succession, but already we are seeing that in this pond, especially here, the water's quite clear, the vegetation's coming around it, and already this year we have seen newts inside of it, and this pond is only 2 years old. It's not great crested newts yet, but it is smooth newts, and once smooth newts move in, great crested newts aren't far behind them. So this pond is doing very well. The other ones will surely follow, as long as we can continue to take care of them, maybe lessen the antisocial behaviour, etc. but it is doing very well. We have our other amphibians on site, so our toads, our frogs. We have seen them in the grassland areas, especially this year we saw them entering the ponds. And also here, if you ignore the grubby table, which I was yet to polish that day, this is also a snake skin. I believe grass snake, I think. But that's just to show its size. And this was found under one of those corrugated sheeting. So that proves that we have reptiles on the site as well, which we wasn't even sure that we had. We'd had a few reports, but not for decades that we had reptiles. We knew we had the habitat for them. We had the tusky grassland, for example, but not necessarily we'd had any sightings. So even though we only found the shed skin of a snake, that then proves that we do have a population there, and they are using the habitats that we have implemented for them. So overall, it is being a success, and hopefully it will become more of a success the more that we do. Thank you so much for listening.
Could I say a big thank you, Courtney, a double thank you actually.
Thank you for having me.
Not only for delivering a wonderful enlightenment of the holistic nature of the Newt Route, for giving us a much better understanding of where you're going and the kind of processes to deliver it, but also for standing in at such short notice for us.
That's okay.
That's particularly welcome.
Yeah,
so
that's
thank
all
you
right.
very much. So could we all thank Courtney in the usual way?